Hi everyone, welcome. How's everyone doing tonight? It's nice to see you. My name is Carol Centers. I'm the events director here at Bookshop Santa Cruz, and we are just thrilled to celebrate Malcolm Harris and his new book, What's Left? 3 Paths Through the Planetary Crisis. Our event is co-sponsored by Leadership Santa Cruz County, whose applications, by the way, for the 2025-2026 cohort are still open for a few more days until April 30th. If anyone here is interested in checking that out, you can talk to me afterwards and I'll give you some more info on that. Please silence your devices if you have not already done so. And as we get started, a couple additional housekeeping notes. Our event will run about an hour tonight with a presentation from Malcolm Harris, as well as audience Q&A. And then that will be followed by a book signing at the table to my left. We welcome you to join the signing line to have your book signed. We do ask that you purchase the book first before joining the signing line. And just hold on to your seat so we know you're all taken care of. Sometimes you get a little distracted after having like your interaction and then you drift away, and we don't want that. We have more great events coming up in our events calendar, including the wonderful Alison Bechtel, who will be here May 28th at the Rio. You may know her from the Bechtel test, her comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, or her best-selling memoir, memoirs plural. And her new comic novel, Spent, grapples with how to live in a world that is coming apart politically and planetarily. Tickets are still available, and we'd love to see you there. And we also have a kids event on June 25th with Brooke Thompson for her picture book, I Love Salmon and Lampreys, A Native Story of Resilience, which is an inspiring story about a river, a successful native-led movement for environmental justice, and the making of a scientist. So we hope to see you there. That's here in the store on June 25th, 4 p.m. Also, save the date for June 26th with Leadership Santa Cruz County. They will be working with Charles Duhigg for a really fun event at the Rio. Tickets will be available soon, so sign up for our emails and stay tuned on our Instagram to keep tuned up to what's going on here at our events program. And you can also grab a flyer from this table right over here, or the table over there, and you might notice what else is on the table. Lots of books. Amazing. We'd love for you to purchase a book tonight. Your book purchase allows us to produce these free community events. They directly support our local economy, jobs, and independent culture. And they show the publisher that our audience here in Santa Cruz is invested and engaged in author events, which means they will send more amazing authors to us. So please buy books. Thank you so much. But now on to the main attraction. Climate change is the unifying crisis of our time, but the scale of the problem can be paralyzing, especially when corporations are actively staving off changes that could save the planet, but which might threaten their bottom line. To quote Greta Thunberg, despite very clear science and very real devastation, the adults at the table are still saying blah, blah, blah. Something has to change, but what and how? Malcolm Harris offers 3 paths to consider in What's Left, which came out just last week. Malcolm is also the author of the national bestseller Palo, Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Kids These Days, The Making of Millennials, and swear words coming, Shit is Fucked Up and Bullshit, which I ordered 6 copies of and they all sold out. So anyway, we're gonna get more of that in. Malcolm was born right here in Santa Cruz, graduated from the University of Maryland, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and many other outlets, bringing a sharp, uncompromising voice to the history and future of capitalism in America. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Malcolm Harris.
So much for thank you all so much for being here. This is awesome. I've never had the opportunity to read in Santa Cruz before, so this is a exciting one for me, even though the bookstore, I think, conned my publicist a little bit, who believed that Santa Cruz was just another Bay Area stop. Not quite. But I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to be here with all of you. I'm gonna talk for around a half an hour, but it looks like we've got an awesome crowd here, and I don't want to be cutting off questions, so I'll try and save plenty of time for that. Instead of reading from the book, which is a little like eyes down, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about why I decided to write this book, what the premise is for it, how it's structured, so that when you pick up your copy after, you know what you're getting into, and you know a little bit about what the premise is. I first thought about how I was going to write this book, or the ingredients that came to be the book, in 2019 when I was doing a little consulting for the Shell Oil Company. No, I really was. I was really doing some consulting for the Shell. It's good that one always gets a laugh. Like, why did Shell Oil Company call you to consult? And they did. And that's still a very good question. As Corel told you, my first book is called Kids These Days, The Making of Millennials. And when I wrote that book, I didn't know that generational writing is another kind of con, and that every single one of those books is an advertisement for corporate consulting services. Literally every single person who writes about generations and how generations work and whatever, all of them spend most of their time doing corporate consulting, saying, like, here's how you sell products to this generational cohort. And so Shell saw, think about that next time you see one of those books. Shell saw my book and reached out to me and said, we'd love for you to join us in London, and some of our C-level executives, for a scenario planning exercise around climate change. And Shell's been doing these scenario planning exercises for like 50 years now. It actually goes back to this like hippie idea that you need to think in terms of deep history. You need to think about like, what's the future going to be in like 50 years? What's the future going to be in 100 years? And then plan what you're doing around that, which some enterprising corporate consultants sold them on a long time ago. And they keep doing it. They're still doing it today. And so that's what they were asking me to do. And the deal with these corporate consulting gigs is that the conditions are much better than writing. Like, writing's hard, and they don't pay you a ton of money, mostly, to do the writing work. But the corporate consulting work is very easy, and they pay you a bunch of money, and they fly you business class, and like take you out to fancy dinners, and they just want to sort of chat with you. And that's what consulting is, it turns out. Maybe some people in the audience know that already. But because it's such a good deal, because it's such a good offer for the authors that they're bringing out, they don't think anyone is like stupid enough to screw it up. So they don't make you sign non-disclosure agreements in order to talk with C-level Shell executives about what they're thinking about the world. Because again, they assume, why would you screw that up? You're in on it. So I said, sure, I would love to join you in London. Can't wait to check out that Gordon Ramsay restaurant. And then I emailed my editor at New York Magazine and said, David, I got a story for you, man. Like, they're not even gonna make me sign anything. They're just gonna tell me this stuff. And I don't even have to, it's not like I have to disclose to them that I'm a writer, because they know I'm a writer. That's why they brought me here. And so it speaks to a certain level of like arrogance among these corporate folks, that they think they can find any writer they want, no matter how like critical their perspective, bring them out and not have them sign anything and assume they won't do exactly this, which I did do. And I published a story in New York Magazine about these conversations I had with all these Shell executives, and they were not happy about it. And I only found out they weren't happy about it later when the Senate, like the US Senate, subpoenaed a bunch of Shell emails, and one like email thread about this article came out. And it's like this Shell CEO or C-level or whatever being like, oh man, like, oh, he got us. He was planning this the whole time. There's nothing we could have done. You know, like the communications people like making excuses for why this happened. And then just one of the Shell executives was like, what's New York Magazine? Which I thought was really funny. And the communications person's like, don't even worry about it. It's not a real magazine. It's like regional. No one reads it. They get it confused with the New Yorker, but completely different. So I thought that was funny. And I published this article, but some parts of my conversations that I had in London with Shell people stuck with me. And what really stuck with me was this one conversation I had with this financial analyst for Shell who's about my age. And he actually didn't like volunteer to go work for Shell. They happened to buy the company he was working at, which is one of the ways Shell has handled its like a recruitment problem with millennials in particular, is that like people don't want to go work for Shell because Shell sucks. But if you're working for like a green battery startup and Shell buys your green battery startup, then you have to like quit your job in order to not work for Shell, and that's a different thing. And so I talked to a bunch of people, like a surprising number of people who hadn't at first like applied for jobs at Shell. They didn't want to work at Shell. They wanted to work in different parts of the energy problem, and Shell was just scooping up these companies as part of this long-term strategy where they really thought that the millennial cohort was going to get control of the investment function and push companies like Shell off of fossil fuels. I'm not sure if they still think that now. But what this analyst told me was really interesting, because we were talking about what happens when Shell does decarbonize. Right? What does it mean for Shell Oil Company to decarbonize a particular oil well? And so I was asking him, like, what literally happens to an oil well? And he says, well, we sell it. I was like, oh, okay. Who buys it? And why? And he says, well, we sell it to operators who can operate it at a lower cost. And that means that they're going to be evading environmental restrictions, and it means they're going to be evading labor restrictions, and it means they're going to be harder to regulate. It's going to be owned by some shady operator. He ends up comparing it to, I think, the war on drugs. That would be like sort of like drug cartels, you know, that we're going to have like fossil fuel cartels and or like fossil fuel criminal operations, and that the big companies are going to sell to these criminal operations that are going to operate them regardless of the law and regardless of the sort of pressure campaigns that can affect a large publicly traded company like Shell. And I was sort of like, okay, you know, like that doesn't sound a lot like actual decarbonization. That sounds a lot like, in fact, an increasing intensity of carbonization, because one of the environmental regulations that they're going to be evading, in fact, the principal environmental regulation that they're going to be evading is about flaring gas. So it's called flaring gas, and it's where you burn off excess gas in the production of gas rather than trying to contain it for environmental reasons. So the function of Shell decarbonizing a particular fossil fuel asset is actually not to decrease or end the production of fossil fuels from that asset. Rather, it's actually going to increase the carbon cost of a particular well. And I was sort of like, okay, well, that seems like a problem to me. You know, if you are the companies that are doing the planning for decarbonization, if we're asking you to do this for society, then we're kind of stuck here because this isn't real decarbonization. And what he told me, and he told me pretty straight up, is we don't plan to lose money. And that was a sentence that just stuck with me. It just stuck in my head, and it's got all these different like ways you can think about it. Like, we don't plan to lose money, or like we don't plan to lose money. We don't plan to lose money. And it's true. I mean, he, as a financial analyst for Shell, can't plan to lose money. If he goes to his boss and says, like, "Hey, boss, this is my like analysis. This is what we should do," and his boss looks at it and says, like, "Well, this looks like we lose money. You're fired. I'm going to find someone who is going to do this analysis and find a way that we make money, because that's our job." And if his boss was to say, "You know what? You're right. I've had a change of heart. Whether it costs money or not, we should make these changes. Let's cap this well." Then he would be fired. And I say he on purpose, right? Like, but it's he or she would be fired. And by the shareholders. The shareholders would remove the CEO if the CEO made such an irresponsible decision. And so we're not really talking about like the greed of this private company, right? Or the greed of particular people. Certainly not this guy I was talking to who thought he was going to work for a green battery startup or whatever, and is just trying to figure out what to do with his life. He's not responsible for the carbonization of the atmosphere, and at the same time, he's absolutely responsible for the carbonization of the atmosphere. And if he weren't, somebody else would be. And that takes away the feeling of responsibility, but it doesn't take away the fact that the atmosphere is being increasingly carbonized. And that's different from the way we usually think about global warming as a social problem, right? We think about it as a problem of like greedy private actors, perhaps, or of short-sighted policy. But what this made clear to me is that this is a real structural problem that goes to the real root of how we organize society as a whole at a global level, right? Not individually. We could do something similar with internal combustion engine cars. We ban them tomorrow in the United States. What would happen to those physical cars, right? What would happen to like the Porsche down the street? Are we going to like turn that into scrap? Are we going to turn it into a piece of art or something? No, it's going to go on a boat, and it's going to go to a different country where they don't have that law. And someone's going to buy it at a discount and fill that Porsche with gasoline and drive it and be super psyched that they have a Porsche that they bought for a discount. And that's not one car. That's going to happen with all the cars, right? That's like someone will buy them. People will be incentivized to buy them because that's one of the ways that they access the things that they need in order to live, right? That car could be the difference for someone somewhere between having a job and not having a job, or having a job that's really good and a job that's really bad, or like getting the crops that they picked from their field to a cooled storage warehouse in time or not. These things aren't just like opinions or feelings. They really get to how we make lives for ourselves. And so it's not just a company like Shell that feels compelled to keep an oil well operating, because for every oil well that's going to keep operating, you need workers who feel compelled to sell their labor in order to operate those oil wells. And let me tell you, working at a flaring oil well, from the descriptions that I've read, not a great job. And yet, around the world, and this has been verified by reporting, in the New York Times since then, that Shell is in fact doing this exact thing. They're in fact selling these oil wells to private equity-owned, shady LLCs or whatever that are operating them in this way and resume flaring. Flaring is something that you can see from space. It's not like secret, and at the same time, it's not like against the particular laws in these particular places. It's only stopped because Shell was under pressure to do so. And so these people who feel compelled to work at oil wells that are environmentally hazardous, proximately, right, for them individually, not to mention environmentally hazardous for the whole world and the world that their children will live in, they feel compelled to do so not because someone's putting a gun to their head and saying, go work at this oil well or I'm going to shoot you in the head. It does happen, but mostly that's not why people go work at oil wells. And it's also not because they think they're going to go get rich and have an easy life. That's not why people go work at oil wells, though I'm sure some people do. And certainly some of the people who buy those oil wells think that. But mostly people feel compelled to go work at oil wells for the same reason we all feel compelled to go work, which is that we know on some level our access to the things that we need and the things that the people around us need is dependent on us having that job, on making ourselves valuable to the system in one way or the other. So it's not that if you don't go to work this morning, you're going to get kicked out of your house. It's that if you don't go to work this morning, maybe a couple steps down the line, you could get kicked out of your house. And you walk around and you see examples of what could happen to you if you lose your grip on that job, on an ability to make a living. And that's distributed, individually, right? We don't have to think about that collectively. That's the responsibility of every individual person to make themselves valuable within the system, or to find someone who can help them, who can make themselves valuable within the system. That's on each of us. And so that sets up this chain where fossil fuels are valuable. We know that in the world, right? That escapes our attempt to regulate them even just because you can pour them in a car and drive them around. Fossil fuels have value in our society, in our planetary society. And at the same time, value is the principle by which we organize people's access to the things they need, the very, very basic mediations between us and the world that allow us to get from one day to the other. We have to find ways to make ourselves valuable. And so this sets up what I describe in the book is really the premise, is this oil value life chain, which is that as long as oil is valuable and as long as life is how we organize ourselves, value is how we organize our lives, then any sort of plan or strategy or like climate change idea, policy, whatever, that doesn't address that chain is bound to fail. It cannot possibly succeed. No matter how you move, and this is true at the state level as well, right? If all we had to do was nationalize fossil fuel reserves, the world's fossil fuel reserves, put them under government control, we would already be done, because actually most fossil fuel reserves in the world are nationalized. They're controlled by governments. And yet governments face these exact same conditions. There's no government in the world who has decided we are going to keep all of our fossil fuels in the ground because we recognize our obligation to humanity and the future of the world, and we recognize that this is opposed to that, and we're not going to do it. We're going to make sure that no fossil fuels are extracted and burned in our country. No one has done that. Even if they have an absolute sort of progressive commitment to the world, an ecological commitment to the world, they know that the people that they are responsible for in their country are dependent on fossil fuels, and not in an illusory way, not in a way that we think of like Americans like driving Hummers around or whatever, but in the way that we were talking about, that your access to the things that you need in order to live is mediated by your ability to make yourself valuable, and fossil fuels are valuable. Which means even a country like Venezuela that it has no illusions about, the world system that we're in and what fossil fuel extraction leads to, is heavily dependent on fossil fuel extraction, even like the eco-communes in the mountains, because that can be the difference between being able to drive to a hospital and not being able to drive to a hospital, right? Is fossil fuels in this world. And so we know that water is life. We know that we need clean water in order to live as members of the human species. We know that clean air is essential. We know that a habitable environment is essential. We know that collectively. These are needs that we all share. And yet, at every level, in every society in the world, we act as if fossil fuels are more important. We act as if oil is life in a way that is more true than water is life. And that shook me. That idea shook me. The idea that oil is life in a way that's hard to avoid, that we can't just think better of or choose better of, is a lot. And that in a very different way than we normally discuss climate change. And so when I was thinking about strategies through this planetary crisis, it had to be strategies that could at least possibly address this oil value life chain, and the way that it forces every one of us to engage in behavior that we know is destructive for our society every single day. We absolutely know that we are destroying the earth in pretty much everything we do, especially as Americans. And yet we be compelled to do it, compelled every single day. And it's not because we don't care. It's because this is a planetary scale system that controls all life on Earth. And that any strategy we got is going to have to shatter some element of that chain, right? And so at first when I was writing this book, I thought, well, this is all going to be about how we need to shatter the chain between value and life. This is about how everyone needs to be a communist. This is like value form theory is the only way to understand the climate crisis, even possibly analytically. It's the only way it could work. And then I thought about that for a little while. And then I decided that was perhaps not the best argument to make. And it was the best argument, not just rhetorically, although rhetorically I found that I'm right, everyone listen to me, stop believing what you believe and believe what I believe. Not super effective. It works every once in a while, and that's pretty cool, but generally not very effective. And we have to be realistic in this moment, right? We're talking about a time scale of years, maybe a few decades, definitely not centuries. And in that time scale, people are pretty committed to the political strategies they hold right now, right? I don't think we have time to convince everyone to find some sort of illusory unity behind one particular strategy. And so the setup I used instead was I thought of 3 strategies that seemed analytically viable to me. Whether I think they're the right strategy, for 2 of them I don't. I tried to depict them as strong as I possibly could, as even-handed as I could for all of these strategies. So for each of these 3 chapters, I give 5 sections about why it's the right strategy, what its strengths are, and 3 about some places where it's not strong, where it's weak. And the way I think about the 3 strategies relating to each other is as puzzle pieces. And if we think about puzzle pieces, perfectly round puzzle pieces would not be very useful. And even perfectly square puzzle pieces, even if you could fit them together, not very strong, right? It doesn't hold together. Puzzle pieces work because they have these inlets and protrusions and odd shapes. Those are the spaces where they click together. And so this book was an attempt to map the coastlines of what I see as the three analytically viable strategies for dealing with this planetary crisis. I call them marketcraft, public power, and communism. I tried to pick like non-triggering titles there. It worked for the first two. I gave up by the end. But my hope is that people understand and read this not as a search for like a key to a lock, which I don't have. If I did, I swear I would give it to you all. I don't have it. Instead, I hope people see it as sort of a mapping of a field. And I imagine that you'll recognize yourselves in different places, in different parts of this chapter. And maybe that'll help break down some of the lines between some of these strategies, because I really think there's no way we're going to form the movement that we're going to be able to look back and say, that was the victorious climate movement. You know, because I need to be clear that I really believe that we're going to win, that we're going to come out the other side of this thing, and we are going to be looking back and trying to understand what it is we did, how we came through, how we beat fascism, because I think we're going to have to beat fascism as part of this planetary strategy, right? And we are going to win. We are going to beat fascism. There will not be a 1,000-year Trump Reich. I swear to God, it's not going to happen. We'll see if they get to a year, right? We'll see if they get to a year. And so the question of this book isn't, are we going to win? It's how are we going to win? And what is the shape of the movement that we're going to look back and say, we didn't know we were building that. A lot of us disagreed. A lot of us like said shitty things to each other, believed the worst about each other sometimes. But that was the movement that was able to bring us from where we are now to where we need to get, which is I think, a long way. But it's a way that most of us in this room, I think, are going to see in our lifetimes. And so we need to be prepared to find those shapes and to find coherence among these three strategies across difference. And I think we're going to do it. I really, really swear that we're going to. And if there's one thing you can take away from this book, it's that we have to find the way, but that we're going to find the way. Thank you so much. I'll take some questions. I hope you guys do. Yes.
Waiting to ask. Well, you just said we're going to defeat fascism. We're going to solve the climate crisis.
Hell yeah.
Is that like a manufactured optimism, or do you have a basis for that? And then my other question has to do with the book Abundance, because a lot of our politicians are into this book, and I'm trying to figure it out myself. And so I'd like for you to comment on what you think about the book and its strengths and weaknesses. Is that okay to ask those two?
Yes. Two questions is great. On the first question, I'm not a gambler. I don't play the odds, and I'm also not a depressive. And I feel like a lot of us on the left tend, what kind of our like emotional constitution tends to be more on the depressive side. And that's useful, right? Because there's a lot that's wrong with the world, and we try to like look at it very clearly, and that can be like very, very hard, and people get worn down and tend to have a sort of negative outlook on the world. It doesn't mean that they're willing to switch sides, right? But you can sort of like collapse. You can fall into yourself, and you can find yourself in a place of dread. Like I said, I'm not a depressive. It's not part of my like emotional temperament. And so even if we've just got like a tiny sliver of odds, I will like pick up that sliver and try to like stab our enemies with it, right? It's like there's something to do even with the tiniest sliver of odds. And if that's all we've got for a world that's not based on like border walls and gunships, then I'll take it, right? I'll take that 2% and go to battle with that. And I hope you all will come with me, right? And if we can convince more people that that's worth doing, that, no matter how bad the odds, we're going to fight till the end, then I think our odds are going to increase, right? Then I think our little bit gets bigger. And so it's not, that question isn't independent of us, right? It takes us to figure out what the odds are, and it takes them too. And I think they're not nearly as strong as they think they are in this moment. And they're not nearly as courageous as we are. And they're weak. The things that they believe are weak. And I think the partial strategy is based on like nationalism and racism and, you know, building walls around cities, which we know they're about to do, right? We know they're going to start with that shit. Those are weak answers, right? They will crumble before the truth, which is that all people are equal and all peoples are equal. And that truth is indefeatable in my mind. You could burn the whole planet and that will still be true. And I think that's something to fight with. Abundance. I have read the book. Anyone read the Abundance book in this room? Yeah. I like I looked at it.
Looks like this.
It looks like that. You know, don't advertise the book. I wrote a review of it, actually. People can go read it on the Baffler magazine. How should I put this? So the strategies in my book, which I think the first chapter, Marketcraft, actually has a lot of overlap with the imaginary of the Abundance book, right? It's saying we can transform our tools, our market tools, to achieve the things that we need. That's what Marketcraft says, that markets are a tool that people use, societies of people can use to achieve the things that they want. The market does not pre-exist us. The market is not an elder god that we have to worship or something. The market is not our human nature, absolutely. The market is one of many tools that societies of people can use. That's the first strategy in my book, is to use the market in this way to recognize our social control over the market and use it to develop the technologies and the tools and like the physical things that we need. So I think there's a lot of overlap between the endpoints in that strategy and the endpoints they're talking about in Abundance. But the mechanism that they really use in Abundance is market fundamentalist. They believe that markets have answers that we don't have, and that what we can do is make life easier for the markets. We can get out of the way. We can produce scientific knowledge for the markets so that they can use that on our behalf. And we can make it easier to build houses so that they can build houses for it. Because right now, housing developers would love to just build us more cheap houses to live in. We're just making it too hard for them. And if we got out of their way, then they could provide the things that we want. And I don't believe that's true. I believe that markets are, again, a tool that we can use to achieve what we want, but that left to their own devices, market players will not do that. They will not make life easier for us or make a better planet. And in fact, the ways that they invest, the ways that they exercise their social planning prerogative is going to make life worse for us. And so one of the examples in that book, I live in Philly, and they use Philly as one of the examples. They use out here a lot more often. But one of their examples is from Philly, and they give Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro a whole lot of credit for rebuilding I-95 through Philadelphia very quickly. Because there was an explosion, there's this truck, a fuel truck exploded under one section of I-95. It's a very ridiculous fossil fuel culture. We blew up the freeway with our big tanker truck full of oil. American problems. And so they did. They blew a hole in this freeway that a lot of people use. This interstate, I-95, that goes through Philadelphia. And they were like, wow. And Governor Shapiro cut a lot of corners, not on labor, because it's still a very unionized city, but he cut a bunch of regulatory corners in order to rebuild I-95 way faster than anyone thought they could. And the commentary from sort of the policy people was like, this is the kind of action we need. We need politicians who are willing to, cut through red tape and fix things faster than the system would have them do it, and we need to just do it. We need to just build. And this is a model for what we should be up to. Except I-95 going through Philadelphia in the first place, which cuts the city off from its waterfront, is a terrible idea. It's one of the examples of a whole era of terrible urban planning. that was designed to create suburban car sprawl on purpose and to like make life in the city worse so that people would move to the suburbs because that's how society should be arranged. Because they believe this on an ideological level in the 20th century, in a way that I think the abundance authors are opposed to. They would say very clearly that they're opposed to this sort of car-based society that was built in Philadelphia's case, actually, by Kevin Bacon's father. The actor Kevin Bacon's father did much of the urban design for Philly's, and like a bad job creating all this like urban car sprawl. And so that's what I see as like the abundance philosophy, is like build, don't think. And my answer is like, well, we need to build. That is true, but I think we need to think. I think we need to like think a lot about what's going on. And the idea that we should spend fewer of our social resources doing like environmental investigations about the kind of construction we're doing seems totally ridiculous to me given our situation, right? Isn't our problem that we've done too little environmental planning? And if our planning systems, and if these environmental checks, and we need to also think about how the changing environment is going to affect the things we build, not just the way that the things we build are going to affect the environment. And if we don't have enough resources right now devoted to that process, then we need to devote more resources to it. We don't need to cut it. We don't need to try to think less. We need to think more. And that's a place where I really, I think, separate from the abundance crowd. Not to mention the idea that we need all these other strategies. They're really focused on their one strategy. And it's ultimately, I think, a political effort to try to box out a lot of economic progressives who made a lot of inroads into the leadership of the Democratic Party during the early years of the Joe Biden administration. I think there are a lot of like free market fundamentalist organizations who got really freaked out at the changing conventional wisdom within the Democratic Party and put a bunch of money behind this ideas and like did some really good marketing for this idea that we need to deregulate. And it's very good branding for deregulation, right? Like abundance. Well, who doesn't want more stuff? Well, I don't know. Maybe some people here in Santa Cruz know that that is not actually the answer to our solution, to our situation. And it's also not a good book. Just like, it's not. It's a bad book. I haven't found one person to look me in the eyes and tell me it's a good book. So maybe one of those people's in the audience, but I doubt it. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, like, if you think that climate transition means that Americans, Europeans need to basically like give up a bunch of stuff that we're very used to, and if so, just like what your thoughts are on how we get to that, or if you think that no, that we like don't, that we can sort of have a kind of communism of abundance. I'm also curious to hear about that. Thank you.
It's a great question. So, and this is a cop-out, I understand. Forgive me. A lot of that is going to be in my next book, which is that as part of running into this book, one problem I ran into is the idea that we're going to have to convince ourselves and each other to put other values above, in particular, convenience. Yes. And it was convenience itself that is the value that I kept running into. It wasn't even like the amount of stuff. It certainly wasn't the quality of stuff, which has been degrading for decades, if not centuries, right? It isn't the quality of our social lives, which again has been continually degrading. It is this principle of convenience that people are like unreasonably obsessed with, and that is a huge, huge mental block for a lot of people. And when I went to go try to find a book to read about, the history of convenience, how we think about this concept, what it even means, there's not even a strict definition of convenience that we can all think of. I couldn't find it because no one has written that book yet. But I will. So come back in 2 years. Corral's like, yeah, you're going to come back here. 2 years. Convenienced. I signed the contract. They already paid me the advance. I got to work on it. That said, yeah, I don't think it's about more or less in terms of like quantity of our lives, which I don't think is really ultimately why we're alive. It isn't what we're like seeking. And so this like attention to quality is definitely one of the things I talk about in the book. Because when we pay attention to quality and the quality of our lives, we can think about our needs differently. And this is one of the virtues of the communist strategy out of the 3 strategies, is that it's able to think about needs not in a market way. It's able to think about needs in like a species way. So one way I like to talk about it is that like, if we talk about how many shoes does this room full of people need, in a value-based society, that's not a question about feet. It's a question about like how valuable each of us can make ourselves relatively on the market, and what kind of priority we place on shoes, and what the shoemaking labor cost is, and all of these things that are very, very impersonal and have nothing to do with the fact that most of us in this room have 2 feet, and that everyone needs two shoes to go on their feet. And maybe that's okay in a society that has enough shoes to go around. But when you're thinking about a need like decarbonization, you can't buy that individually, right? That's not a market good that one of us can purchase more of than another one, right? This is something we all need as humans on this planet, as like animals on this planet even, right? As mammals on this planet, we have that need. And so a system of what I call a social metabolic order that is not based on each of us making ourselves individually valuable, but based on what are our abilities collectively and what are our needs collectively and individually, and how do we make those 2 things match up. I think only a system like that can really, really understand what our needs actually are. Otherwise, like you said, we end up thinking about like, well, is it more or is it less? What do I need? I need this. I need to make sure that my people are safe. I need to make sure that like my kid has enough. Make sure that like my parents have somewhere safe to be. And to do that, I need $7 million, right? Like, in some places, you might think that. You might like and like really think that, like really believe it and act like it, and like fight someone who is trying to take it from you, whether it's like exactly true or not. And it could be even exactly true, right? Your kid could be really sick, and then you do have to fight everyone else. And that, I don't think that kind of approach can help us ultimately solve our problems.
When I think of the climate crisis, I think it's somewhat derivative of the technological revolution from the Industrial Revolution. Like if you plot carbon in the atmosphere, human population, they all grow exponentially with the Industrial Revolution and kind of the exponential growth of technology. And so technology has brought us to this crisis point, but I often can't help myself and feel like technology is the only way to solve this, and that you can never ask people to give up things because we all live in survival mode, and we're all just trying to live our best lives all the time. So it has to be engineering your way out of it. But that's kind of the only path forward, is heading further along the exponential curve. I just wonder how that fits with the 3 different paths you kind of outlined in the book.
Yeah, I'm very careful to look for, the question is, it seems like technology is causing these problems, and yet it also seems like the only answer to our problems. What are we going to do? So I talk about technology in a couple ways in this book, because that's sort of assuming a market fundamentalist idea of technology. That's not when technology was invented. In fact, it's not even when like the steam engine was invented. The concept for the steam engine was invented in the Renaissance. But the Renaissance didn't have the social relations to make that possible in terms of building it and exploiting the technology in the Industrial Revolution the way you're talking about. And so it took much longer for these technologies to actually come into play the way they are, creating growth. It's not the technology itself that creates the growth. And I think that's a fetishistic way to look at it, to think that like it's objects that are ultimately responsible for what happens. It's about the social relations underpinning the technologies and what technologies are useful to us. So in a society in which we're focused on our collective needs, principally on decarbonization, it's not that internal combustion engines, fossil fuel-based internal combustion engines don't work. And it's not as if they aren't useful. And it's not as if you can't even run like, air conditioning systems off of them that will save you from the heat or whatever. The hope is that we have a social system in which we've decided this is not useful for us collectively. Even though we have this technology, we can't put it to use. for reasons that we've decided socially. And that can only happen when we have social control over our metabolic processes, not just production. Because one of the problems with living in capitalism is we think we live in a mode of production, because we live in the mode of productioniest, mode of production of all time, where our access to the things we need is mostly determined around production. But there are other cycles that are at least as important. So reproduction, waste, maintenance. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a waste problem, right? We cannot solve our waste problems and can't think of them even as core to our system in the way that you're talking about. So your question is like, well, production, we live in a production system. Production is the only way we can get out of this. What are we going to produce to solve this problem? But we have a waste problem. We have a waste management problem. And I don't think the answer is to produce the right thing that we need. We don't need to produce an artificial tree that like sucks carbon out of the air at a rate that is fast enough to decarbonize the atmosphere, right? I don't think we're going to create like robot trees and robot bees that will solve our problem. I don't think that's like ecologically correct, and I don't think it will ultimately work. And I talk about a number of contradictions and antinomies within the capitalist production system in this book. A good one is whale hunting. So whales were hunted to the brink of extinction for whale oil, right? And so you'd think the use of petroleum as a substitute for whale oil would mean whales are off the hook, right? You stop hunting whales because you don't need whale oil anymore. Wrong. In fact, whales were never in more danger because petroleum made it way faster to chase whales and way easier to chase whales. And so suddenly it was cheaper to hunt whales, and whale oil itself was cheaper. And so it took like direct social regulation to say, we got to stop hunting these whales. We couldn't invent a solution by coming up with an alternative to whale oil because that doesn't give us control over what actually happens in our society. We need to take social control over that immediately, and we can't do that just through producing, especially market goods. Which doesn't mean we don't need to produce a bunch of stuff. We absolutely do, including like electricity transmission lines. I talk about pump storage hydropower facilities a lot in the book. So there's plenty of building here, but I don't think we can like fetishize the objects and hope that the objects will save us from what really is a social problem.
I was wondering if I could hear your thoughts on what to me seems like a really big hurdle towards a planetary liberation, which is the war industries of the U.S. war economy.
What are we going to do about the war industries and the U.S. war economy, which includes the single largest institutional user of fossil fuels, which is, of course, the U.S. military? We have to fight them. They are our enemies. Pure waste, pure destruction and waste, right? We cannot afford that. Cannot afford it in our society. And I think this is something that the abundance people get completely wrong, right? They for whatever reason are unable to say, well, we don't need an abundance of bombs. Because some of them do think we need an abundance of bombs. There are people within the Abundance Coalition who think we need to, principally what we need to do right now is prepare for a third world war with China. Yeah, that's scary as hell, and we need to say no. And I think the left can show real leadership on this question, and by contending with the war industries directly. And I think that's one of the points of unity I describe at the end of the book, that all progressive forces within society need to array ourselves directly against the arms industry, especially in America. When our weapons are being used to commit genocide in Gaza, to cross every red line that was established in the 20th century, to really put us down the path to destruction. No one has more interest in that than the U.S. war industry. And so we need to declare ourselves the enemy of that industry and act like we are their enemy, because they're our enemy, and they're acting like it.
First of all, thank you so much. Everything's such a downer, so I really appreciate your optimism. I feel like I'll leave less like a depressive lefty than I...
All right. Nothing wrong with being a depressive lefty, to be clear. Like puzzle pieces.
Could you talk a little bit about the ecological basis for your optimism, like in addition to the social movement basis for optimism?
Yeah, like what can we do, or examples of people.
Like how is the Earth itself going to come back? Like, is that part of the puzzle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to take a lot of work from a keystone species such as us. I think that we're going to have to devote ourselves a lot to repair, and also to preparation for disasters that are coming and that are already scheduled, right? That are already written in stone in history. Some of that stuff we're not going to be able to escape. But I think there's a difference between a future that's disastrous and disasterful, and I think the situation for both us and the planet is going to be disasterful. We know that things are not going to be the same. The question about, like, the other thing I wanted to say about, are people going to have to give stuff up? Like, people are going to give stuff up either way. Like, the lives that we're accomplished with, the lives that you've been planning for your children, right? Like, those lives are over. In a way that I think is almost sort of analogous to proletarianization in the 19th century, where people got thrown off the land and into jobs that they suddenly had to do. And the way that they've been living for maybe hundreds of years was destroyed in one lifetime, right? And their children would lead completely different lives than they imagined. I think we're in for something like that. And I think a lot of that is going to have to revolve around ecological systems and ecological repair. It's going to be a much bigger part of our lives. I think the Earth as a planetary system is going to defy our attempts to destroy it. I don't think, barring like planetary nuclear war, that even if this planet gets a lot hotter, it's going to change and it's going to adapt, and ecological systems are going to change and they're going to adapt, and we're going to have to be one of those. So I don't think there's any sort of like going backwards. We're going to have to go through, and we're going to have to bring the planet with us and bring ecosystems around us with us, and they're going to change. They're already going to change. Like there's no chance we get to maintain any of the like small ecological systems, the gajillion of which our world is made up of. They're all going to change. Everything's going to change. But that doesn't mean it's going to be destroyed. And some things will change in ways in which that were unexpected, right? There are going to be new joys in the world as well as new pains and new kinds of suffering. And we're going to have to find ways to be part of that.
The paths that it sounds like you talk about are very practical, which is very important, but I'm curious if you've given consideration to a path being more spiritual. There are some people that believe that we need to mature into a more spiritual species globally as part of the solution of moving forward. There's a lot to say about that, but I'm just curious if you've given any.
I can understand that. My particular the question. Thank you. See, we planned that. The question is, what about the spiritual dimension? That some people believe that we need a spiritual transformation in our species in order to accomplish the things that we need. How do I handle that aspect? And or what do I think about it? I don't think of myself as a spiritual person, but I think some people might understand my political ideology that way. I'm a Marxist Jew, which means I believe very, very importantly in the equality of all people, the substantive equality of all people, and the coming world in which we are able to fulfill everyone's needs with everyone's abilities. And lots of people think that is a millenarian approach. Some people, analysis of that is better or worse. And some people don't believe that that is founded in fact, right? They believe that it takes a spiritual leap in order to assume the equality of all people. I don't think that's true. I think that is a material fact of this world, and I think that's the transformation that is required from people. And as a group, not even necessarily from all individuals, it's like adherence to that truth. So you could call that a spiritual path, I suppose. It's definitely a religious tradition. I was at Grace Cathedral yesterday talking with the dean of Grace Cathedral. And I was talking about, when you were talking about communism, I was like, yeah, lots of spiritual traditions have the ideas of communism, including the Christian one. who imagined a community of goods around Jesus. So I think it's compatible with a lot of the sort of spiritual ideas about what kind of world we should make. That said, I don't think this transformation isn't going to come from our heads. It's going to come from our practice. And I don't think that has to be necessarily informed by one particular ideology or not. Question?
I was going to ask about the spiritual dimension. However, what I was going to ask is whether any of your solutions require a change in consciousness on the part of people.
Yeah, well, I think they all entail a change in collective consciousness, absolutely. And the principal change in collective consciousness that I think they all share is that the social planning prerogative belongs to society itself. It does not belong to some small group within society. It doesn't belong to capitalist asset holders. It doesn't belong to some community of patriarchs. It doesn't belong to white people. It belongs to the planetary society itself. And that if capitalism has one virtue is that it brought about this planetary society, right? We know that we live on a planet with billions of other people and that we share things like an atmosphere, right? And I think that is a consciousness shift. That does require us to think differently about our world because we've been told for so long that the social planning prerogative doesn't exist, that there is no such thing, and that it doesn't belong to us, so don't worry about it. That all you can plan is for yourself, maybe for your family, if you're lucky. And that's wrong. And I think that's, if there's a shift I can help bring about, that's crucial. Because like I said, we're not going to be able to even get our hands around this problem until we're willing to accept that. So yeah, absolutely. And if that's a spiritual shift, then God damn it, we need a spiritual shift.
I have two questions. First one, I'm a little obsessed by something you said earlier.
All right, already. That's great.
I was wondering how I could get into corporate consulting. Okay, the real question is, what about money in politics, right down to the creation of opinion? So if you want a spiritual shift, the powers that be don't necessarily have that aim. So what about money in politics? How do we manufacture any of this change without addressing that elephant?
Absolutely. And that's one of the, I think, maybe one of the inlets of the market craft strategy is that we shape the playing field for these private actors to make decisions, but then those private actors sometimes get together and decide, well, we don't like this playing field. We would like the playing field to be a little different, and we are market fundamentalists, and we believe that we should be planning, and we can buy the politicians who will have those effects, right? We'll make that happen. I do not believe that America is the best model for how to solve this problem. America has not had a lot of success keeping money out of politics. You know who's had more success is the People's Republic of China. And do you remember Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba? Yeah, for a while there you didn't hear too much about Jack Ma and the founder of Alibaba, right? Because what happens in China is that if individual rich people are playing too big of a social role, assuming too much social planning prerogative, they get their minds changed a little bit about how that works, right? That the society itself says, once again, this is our prerogative to plan society, and don't get confused about what your role is within society. We're not very good here in America at accomplishing that. Which is one of the reasons that America is actually not leading the world towards any climate solutions, right? So yeah, that's a problem. It's a big problem for us as Americans, and one of the reasons that the rest of the world doesn't trust us, right, and can't rely on us in order to come to these solutions. So how are we going to get money out of American politics? That's going to be really tough. It's probably. I hope maybe we can point to the really base bribery of the Trump administration as what happens when we fail to do so, right? We're at the bottom of the well right now as far as money in politics is concerned as Americans. And I hope we're able to, I hope the progressives among us, people who work within the Democratic Party, are willing to have that fight and to say, no, we don't want billionaires running both parties, right? That we need one that takes on that influence. And that's a battle within the party right now, within Democrats, whether we should have, I think Tom Friedman called them Waymo Democrats, who are, great name, I'm so glad he came up with that, Waymos. Waymo Democrats who think that like, we're going to solve these problems through technology, and that our job is to usher in these technologies, and we can do that by working with billionaires, and we just need like the right billionaires. And then there's another wing within the party that says, no, we can create credibility within the American people by attacking these people and saying, social prerogative does not belong to you. Shut up, give us your money. And I think that's a fight worth having. I think a lot of radicals disagree with me about whether there are any fights within the Democratic Party that are worth having. And even if I'm not going to be particularly influential within that fight, maybe some of you will, right? And Godspeed. We need to win that one. Like, that's an important one. But also, I think we can't put all of our eggs in the American basket. Like, the world certainly isn't. But we conceptually, even as Americans, need to understand that that's not how everyone's thinking about what's going to happen. It's not like, it isn't all at stake here. And that's a like basic level of humility that we need to get to internationally, I think. We got one more question? Yeah.
So in the example you just gave about Jackpot with China, my understanding is that wasn't really like the social prerogative that did that, it was the state. And so my question for you is, what do you feel like is the role of like a state or like an entity that provisions goods in a future that is like post-climate change solving environmental problems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think China has modeled a lot of what that state would look like, both around the market craft strategy and then the public power strategy, which is the second strategy, which is what you're talking about, which is using the state directly, whether it's a democratic state or a non-democratic state, to use the state to accomplish the things that we need to do directly. And that's where the public power strategy, plugs the inlet in the market craft strategy and says like, oh, this is a problem where you've got like some guys who decide that they want to make decisions instead. We can fill that. We know what to do with a few guys. And then there are problems with that strategy. There are problems with that as well, right? When you've got a carceral apparatus that feels liberated to just disappear people when they get in the way. What happens when people want to protect a particular waterway from a dam that they don't think is a good idea and have good reason to believe is not a good idea when it's a like state-run company that's trying to build the dam. And so these are sets of problems that don't have a like aha answer, right? There isn't one answer. You say like, oh, well, that's how things should work. The state has all the answers, or like, oh, that's not how things should work. We should just trust indigenous communities to operate the entire social metabolic system. These are like inlets and protrusions that we need to figure out ways to fit together, not just in theory, but in practice, to accomplish the things that we need to in the moments that we need to accomplish them. So if we had fewer influential billionaires in this country, I think things would be going a little differently. It doesn't mean that's the total solution to our problem. But like, yeah, enforcing laws against corporate crime, for example, like could have done us some good. Or if the Biden administration had like crushed crypto, right? That was a very, very easy thing that I still am perplexed about. Is they just like boosted their own enemies, cut their own throat by handing the social prerogative over to these people. Where once again, China says you can't ban Bitcoin, you can't mine crypto. That is an inappropriate use for resources in a world where energy use is tied to carbon emissions and our carbon budget is restricted. It's unacceptable. And instead of saying something like that, which is not crazy, the Democrats said, like, we will endorse this for some reason, probably because of money in politics, right? Like, they got bribed. We know they got bribed. And incorporate it into our financial system so that people's, like, access to the things they need in order to live is now dependent on how people who own crypto assets feel about their crypto assets at any given moment. Like, that's terrible. And so for a bunch of these questions, I feel like America is a particularly bad model. We need to understand America as a particularly bad model, not just like how things are going, you know? Okay, if you didn't get your question answered, you come bother me in the signing round. Totally fine. Thank you all so much again for coming. Thank you, Bookshop, for listening.
Wow, I could listen for another hour to you talk. You're so awesome. Thank you all so much for coming. What a fantastic night. We will continue with a signing line. Please make sure your books are purchased with your receipts, and then we'll line up down this aisle here, and my assistant Laura will help with that. One more round of applause for Malcolm Harris. Thank you all so much.